I've put the sweat of my life into this thing. I have my reputation rolled up in it. And I have stated several times that if it's a failure, I'll probably leave this country and never come back, and I mean it.
He had everything: money, power, genius, and still descended into a nightmare of paranoia and isolation. Howard Hughes didn't just lose control of his empire, the empire slowly consumed him. Behind the public legend was a man trapped by fear, obsession, and untreated illness. This is the chilling truth behind how one of America's greatest tycoons lost his mind. Howard Robard Hughes, Jr. was in a world already shaped by innovation and ambition. His father, Howard R. Hughes, Sr., was the inventor of a revolutionary rotary drill bit that transformed oil drilling and built the Hughes Tool Company into a formidable industrial success. His mother, Aline Gano Hughes, was intensely devoted to her only child, fostering both his intellectual curiosity and an early sense of fragility about his health. From childhood, Hughes displayed signs of unusual brilliance, experimenting with mechanical devices, building radios, and showing a natural aptitude for engineering and mathematics that set him apart from his peers. Despite the family's wealth, Hughes' upbringing was emotionally complex. His mother's protectiveness bordered on obsession, while his father's frequent absences due to business demands left Hughes oscillating between privilege and isolation. This combination helped cultivate his independence, but also planted the seeds of anxiety, perfectionism, and emotional detachment that would later define much of his adult life. He was educated at elite private schools, yet struggled to fit within rigid academic and social structures, preferring solitary invention to conformity. Hughes' life took a decisive turn in his late teens. In 1922, his mother died suddenly from complications following surgery. Just 2 years later, in 1924, his father passed away from a heart attack. By the age of 19, Hughes found himself effectively alone in the world and astonishingly wealthy. He inherited a majority stake in Hughes Tool Company, granting him immense financial power and autonomy at an age when most young men were still dependent on family guidance and institutional discipline. This inheritance gave Hughes something rare: complete freedom from external authority. He was no longer bound by parental expectations, financial limitations, or conventional career paths. The wealth allowed him to abandon formal education. He briefly attended Rice Institute but quickly lost interest, and instead pursue ideas purely on his own terms. He could fund experiments, indulge obsessions, and chase grand visions without oversight or restraint. In many ways, this freedom accelerated his genius, enabling early forays into aviation engineering, bold mechanical experimentation, and eventually motion pictures. Yet the absence of structure came at a cost. Without parental boundaries or institutional accountability, Hughes's developing personality lacked grounding influences that might have balanced his extremes. His perfectionism intensified without challenge, his distrust of others deepened, and his tendency toward isolation grew more pronounced. Wealth insulated him from consequences that might have corrected or moderated his behavior, reinforcing the belief that he could and should control every variable around him. By his early 20s, Hughes stood at a rare crossroads of youth, brilliance, and limitless resources. The same inheritance that empowered his extraordinary achievements also quietly removed the stabilizing forces that helped shape emotional resilience. This duality, unmatched freedom paired with profound isolation, would become the defining tension of Hughes's life, fueling both his legendary accomplishments and his eventual unraveling. As Howard Hughes surged into prominence during the 1920s and 1930s, reshaping both aviation and Hollywood with daring ambition, subtle but unmistakable signs of psychological vulnerability began to surface beneath his public image of brilliance and success. To outsiders, Hughes appeared as a fearless innovator, financing experimental aircraft, breaking airspeed records, and producing lavish, technically ambitious films. Yet, behind the scenes, Those who worked closely with him observed patterns of behavior that suggested a far more complicated inner world. Hughes was famously meticulous, but his attention to detail often crossed into fixation. In aviation, this trait sometimes proved advantageous. He demanded absolute precision in aircraft design, personally scrutinizing blueprints, testing materials, and insisting on repeated revisions long after engineers believed a project complete. However, this same intensity began to spill into everyday routines. He became preoccupied with small, seemingly inconsequential details. Details that most people would overlook or dismiss entirely. One frequently cited example involved his eating habits. Hughes reportedly insisted that peas on his plate be arranged to an exact size and number, rejecting meals if the presentation failed to meet his personal standard. This was not a matter of preference or eccentric taste. It reflected a deeper need for control and order in his immediate environment. Similar patterns appeared in his work in Hollywood, particularly during the production of Hell's Angels. Hughes obsessed over minute flaws in costumes, lighting, and props, sometimes halting filming over imperfections invisible to the camera or audience. Entire scenes were reshot not because of performance issues, but because Hughes perceived microscopic inconsistencies that unsettled him. At the time, such behaviors were often dismissed as the quirks of a demanding genius. The concept of obsessive-compulsive tendencies had not yet entered mainstream understanding, and mental health was rarely discussed openly, especially among powerful men. Hughes' immense wealth further shielded him from scrutiny. Employees complied rather than questioned, and associates learned to accommodate his increasingly rigid expectations. What might have raised alarms in an ordinary workplace was instead reframed as evidence of his relentless pursuit of excellence. Yet these fixations were accompanied by growing emotional distance. Hughes became increasingly withdrawn, preferring controlled environments where he dictated conditions precisely. He slept irregular hours, avoided social obligations, and developed a heightened sensitivity to disruption. As his projects grew larger and more complex, so did his need to micromanage every aspect, often exhausting those around him while reinforcing his own isolation. These early signs did not yet incapacitate Hughes. In fact, they coincided with some of his most celebrated achievements. However, they hinted at an underlying fragility, an internal struggle masked by success and power. The very traits that propelled Hughes forward also narrowed his emotional flexibility, making adaptation and compromise increasingly difficult. Throughout the 1930s and into the mid-1940s, Howard Hughes repeatedly placed his own body at the center of danger, insisting on personally test flying the experimental aircraft he designed and financed. Aviation was still a perilous frontier, and Hughes approached it with a mix of fearless ambition and personal compulsion. He did not merely oversee innovation from a distance. He demanded first-hand control, pushing machines, and himself, beyond known limits. The result was a series of devastating crashes that permanently altered his physical and psychological health. One of the earliest serious incidents occurred during experimental test flights in the 1930s, when mechanical failures and unstable designs led to violent impacts. Hughes survived these crashes, but not without injury. He sustained broken bones, internal trauma, and concussions that left lingering effects. Rather than deterring him, survival seemed to reinforce his belief that he could endure what others could not. Each recovery was followed by a return to the cockpit, often before his body had fully healed. The most catastrophic crash came in 1946 during a test flight of the XF-11 reconnaissance aircraft over Beverly Hills. A mechanical malfunction caused the plane to lose control, crashing into residential neighborhoods and erupting into flames. Hughes was pulled from the wreckage barely alive. He suffered a fractured skull, crushed chest, broken collarbone, cracked ribs, burns, and severe internal injuries. Doctors doubted he would survive. When he did, his body was left permanently damaged. From that point forward, Hughes lived with relentless chronic pain. His spinal injuries and nerve damage made movement agonizing, while head trauma contributed to headaches, dizziness, and cognitive strain. To function at all, he relied heavily on prescription painkillers, particularly codeine and morphine, substances widely used at the time with little understanding of their long-term neurological or psychological consequences. What began as medical necessity gradually became dependency. The constant presence of pain reshaped Hughes' nervous system and emotional state. He became increasingly intolerant of discomfort, noise, and disruption, retreating into tightly controlled environments where he could minimize physical stress. Sleep grew irregular, often fragmented by pain and medication cycles. The drugs dulled his sensations but also blunted emotional responsiveness, contributing to mood instability, irritability, and deepening withdrawal from others. Repeated head injuries further compounded these effects. Even mild traumatic brain injuries, especially when accumulated, can impair emotional regulation, increase anxiety, and reduce psychological resilience. In Hughes' case, the combination of concussions, chronic pain, and narcotic use created a feedback loop. Physical suffering heightened mental strain, while emotional stress intensified his perception of pain. By the late 1940s, the fearless aviator image concealed a man whose body was in near-constant rebellion against him. The crashes did not merely scar Hughes physically, they eroded the internal stability needed to cope with stress, uncertainty, and human connection. His once boundless endurance began to narrow, and the extraordinary willpower that had driven his achievements now struggled against a nervous system shaped by trauma. These injuries marked a turning point, transforming risk from a chosen challenge into a permanent condition, and laying crucial groundwork for the psychological decline that followed. By the 1940s, the psychological patterns that had once appeared as quirks of genius hardened into something far more consuming for Howard Hughes. As his physical health declined and his world narrowed, his need for control intensified, crystallizing into severe obsessive-compulsive disorder that increasingly governed every aspect of his daily existence. What had once been meticulousness became ritual. What had once been caution transformed into paralyzing fear. Central to this transformation was Hughes's escalating germophobia. He developed an overwhelming dread of contamination, convinced that invisible threats lurked on surfaces, objects, and even in the air around him. Everyday interactions became sources of anxiety. He refused to touch doorknobs, telephones, or documents directly, instead requiring aides to handle objects using tissues or layers of paper. These precautions were not casual preferences. They were rigid rules, and deviations provoked intense distress or anger. Cleanliness became an obsession rather than a standard. Food containers were scrubbed repeatedly before being opened, sometimes to the point of damaging the packaging. Meals were rejected if Hughes suspected even the slightest contamination during preparation or handling. He demanded elaborate instructions for how items were to be washed, wrapped, stored, and presented, often revising these rules obsessively and expecting staff to memorize and obey them without error. His written directives grew longer and more detailed, reflecting a mind trapped in cycles of fear and reassurance seeking. Isolation deepened as his rituals expanded. Hughes increasingly confined himself to controlled environments, hotel rooms, penthouse suites, and private residences, where he could dictate conditions with absolute authority. Windows were sealed, lights were regulated, and movements were minimized to reduce perceived exposure to germs. Human contact was reduced to a small circle of aides who acted less like employees and more like extensions of his compulsions, enforcing rules that few fully understood, but all feared violating. At the time, obsessive-compulsive disorder was poorly understood and rarely diagnosed, especially among powerful figures shielded by wealth and influence. Hughes's behavior was often rationalized as eccentricity, the price of genius, or the understandable caution of a man recovering from severe physical trauma. In reality, his condition went entirely untreated. There was no therapeutic intervention, no structured support, and no medical framework to interrupt the worsening cycle of obsession and compulsion. As the 1950s progressed, these behaviors tightened their grip. Hughes's fear of germs merged with his need for absolute control, reinforcing withdrawal from society and amplifying paranoia. The rituals consumed hours, then days, shaping not only his routines but his identity. The world outside his carefully constructed bubble became something to be feared rather than engaged with. The severity of Hughes's OCD stands as one of the most tragic elements of his story. A man who had conquered skies and industries found himself imprisoned by invisible anxieties, locked in repetitive behaviors that promised safety but delivered isolation instead. Untreated and unacknowledged, his disorder quietly overtook the life of one of the 20th century's most extraordinary minds, turning brilliance into confinement and freedom into fear. By the late 1950s, Howard Hughes's psychological deterioration reached a visible and deeply unsettling stage, marked by extreme isolation and the near-total collapse of ordinary functioning. The compulsions that had once governed routines now dictated existence itself. Nowhere was this more apparent than during the infamous dark screening room episode, a period that starkly illustrated how far Hughes had retreated from the external world into a private universe shaped by fear, control, and mental exhaustion. Hughes withdrew almost entirely from human contact, sealing himself inside a darkened screening room for months at a time. The room was kept in perpetual darkness, not for cinematic effect, but because light itself had become intolerable to him, another potential source of discomfort and contamination. Curtains were drawn, windows sealed, and even the smallest intrusion of daylight was treated as a violation. Inside this enclosed space, Hughes established a rigid, repetitive routine that offered the illusion of safety while accelerating his psychological unraveling. He survived on a narrow selection of simple foods, often ice cream, chocolate bars, or plain meals, chosen not for nutrition, but for perceived purity and predictability. Meals were delivered according to exact instructions, wrapped and handled in specific ways to minimize contact. Surrounding him were boxes of Kleenex, stacked and used as protective barriers between his hands and the world. Hughes used tissues to touch objects, open doors, and handle documents, discarding them obsessively after each use. The accumulation of discarded tissues became a physical manifestation of his compulsions, filling the room with the remnants of ritualized fear. Communication with staff was reduced to written notes and rigidly detailed instructions. These directives outlined precise procedures for entering the room, delivering items, and exiting without contaminating the space. Any deviation, even a misplaced step or altered tone, could trigger intense anxiety or anger. Staff members learned to operate in silence and darkness, carefully navigating Hughes's ever-evolving rules, aware that his authority and fragility were inseparable. As isolation deepened, basic self-care deteriorated. Hughes avoided bathing for extended periods, convinced that water and contact posed risks rather than relief. Grooming ceased, clothing went unchanged, and physical neglect compounded the damage already inflicted by years of injury and substance dependence. His body weakened as his mind narrowed, creating a feedback loop in which physical discomfort reinforced psychological retreat. Then, by the beginning of the 1960s, Howard Hughes had largely vanished from public life, retreating into a shadow existence defined by fear, pain, and rigid control. Once one of the most visible innovators in aviation and entertainment, he now avoided direct human contact whenever possible. His reclusion was not simply a preference for privacy. It was driven by deepening paranoia and a psychological need to eliminate unpredictability from his environment. The outside world came to represent threat rather than opportunity. Hughes communicated almost entirely through a small circle of trusted aides, often using handwritten notes or lengthy, meticulously typed memoranda that laid out his instructions in exacting detail. Face-to-face conversations became rare, and when they did occur, they were brief and carefully managed. Even long-time associates were kept at a distance, uncertain whether they would be summoned or dismissed without explanation. Power flowed one way, but trust flowed nowhere. To maintain a sense of safety, Hughes moved repeatedly between hotels, most notably in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and later international locations. These were not casual relocations, they were strategic retreats. Each hotel suite was transformed into a sterile, tightly regulated environment. Windows were sealed, furniture rearranged or removed, and staff were given strict protocols governing cleanliness, noise levels, lighting, and movement. Entire floors were sometimes taken over to prevent unwanted contact, reinforcing Hughes's isolation while granting him the illusion of total control. Paranoia increasingly shaped his perceptions. Hughes grew suspicious of executives, doctors, and even his closest aides, convinced that others sought to manipulate, contaminate, or deceive him. Ordinary disagreements were interpreted as betrayal, and benign actions took on sinister meaning. This mistrust extended into his business dealings, where indecision and delays mounted as Hughes struggled to act in a world he believed was fundamentally hostile. Chronic pain from his earlier aviation crashes continued to dominate his physical experience. Nerve damage, spinal injuries, and headaches made daily life agonizing, and his dependence on prescription medications deepened. Drugs such as codeine and morphine dulled the pain, but also clouded judgment, impaired emotional regulation, and intensified mood swings. As tolerance increased, so did isolation, creating a cycle in which medication became both refuge and prison. Intellectually, Hughes's world narrowed. Once capable of absorbing vast technical detail and strategic complexity, he became increasingly preoccupied with minor threats, procedural minutiae, and personal fears. Social interaction, creative collaboration, and long-term planning, all of which had once fueled his success, fell away. What remained was a defensive existence focused on survival rather than creation. By the late 1960s, Hughes was surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. His wealth and power insulated him from intervention, while his untreated mental illness and addiction eroded the foundations of his extraordinary mind. Reclusion had become his primary coping mechanism, paranoia his constant companion. The decade marked not merely a continuation of decline, but a consolidation of patterns that made recovery increasingly unlikely, sealing his transformation from visionary titan into a figure defined by isolation and mistrust. Non-stopping there, personal interactions were reduced to the bare minimum. Hughes communicated almost exclusively through aides, often issuing written instructions rather than speaking directly. He refused visits from former colleagues, friends, or family, and even rejected the presence of medical professionals. Doctors were viewed as threats rather than sources of help, and Hughes would not permit physical examinations, convinced that medical contact would expose him to contamination or loss of control. As a result, serious health problems went unmonitored and untreated. His intense fear of germs produced a tragic paradox. While he once obsessed over cleanliness, Hughes increasingly avoided bathing altogether, believing that water, touch, and exposure posed greater risks than filth. Over time, hygiene collapsed completely. He often remained confined to hotel rooms for weeks or months, sometimes lying in bed or pacing the same small area, unwilling to allow anyone close enough to clean or assist him physically. This neglect accelerated the deterioration of his already fragile body. Accounts from those who saw him in his final years paint a haunting picture. Hughes was frequently nude or minimally clothed, not out of comfort, but indifference. His hair grew long and matted, his beard untrimmed, and his fingernails and toenails curled and thickened from years without cutting. Severe weight loss became apparent, the result of an erratic and inadequate diet dominated by a narrow range of foods and compounded by long-term substance dependence. His once commanding physical presence dwindled into frailty. Prescription drugs continued to dominate his daily existence. Painkillers and sedatives, originally used to manage injuries and anxiety, became essential to coping with both physical discomfort and psychological distress. Their effects further dulled his awareness, weakened his immune system, and disrupted basic bodily functions. Periods of lucidity grew shorter, while confusion, lethargy, and emotional flatness became the norm. Despite unimaginable wealth, Hughes lived in conditions that bordered on self-imposed imprisonment. Hotel rooms replaced homes, isolation replaced influence, and survival replaced ambition. His businesses continued to operate largely without his direct involvement, guided by proxies interpreting his increasingly erratic directives. The man who once demanded perfection from machines and movies could no longer maintain his own body. Withdrawal had become absolute, and physical decline mirrored psychological collapse. His life stands as a stark reminder that untreated mental illness, compounded by trauma and addiction, can erode even the most extraordinary advantages, leaving behind not legacy and triumph, but silence and decay. By the mid-1970s, Howard Hughes's isolation had hardened into something unmistakably pathological. What once appeared as an eccentric preference for privacy or control had transformed into a closed system of fear, ritual, and withdrawal from reality. By 1976, Hughes had dismissed most of his remaining employees, severing even the limited human infrastructure that had sustained his secluded life. Those who remained functioned less as aides than as caretakers of his compulsions, operating within an environment governed by rigid rules rather than human judgment. Hughes confined himself almost entirely to a single hotel suite, a space he treated not as temporary lodging but as a fortress against contamination and unpredictability. Every aspect of the room was controlled. Lighting was dimmed or eliminated entirely, curtains were kept drawn, and noise was minimized to the point of near silence. Objects were arranged with precision and rarely moved. Sensory exposure, light, sound, touch, even smell, was perceived as a threat, something capable of overwhelming or contaminating him. To reduce these risks, Hughes narrowed his world until it became manageable only by being nearly non-existent. Daily life inside the suite was governed by compulsions rather than choice. Routine actions, eating, drinking, moving from one place to another, were surrounded by ritualized behaviors designed to neutralize fear. Items were handled indirectly, often through tissues or layers of paper. Instructions to staff grew increasingly elaborate, specifying not only what should be done but how it should be thought about, repeated, and verified. These rituals consumed hours and left little room for spontaneity or relief. What had begun decades earlier as coping mechanisms for anxiety, chronic pain, and loss of control had now reversed their function. Instead of protecting Hughes from distress, they imprisoned him within it. His need to eliminate uncertainty removed nearly all human interaction, emotional stimulation, and intellectual engagement. The outside world, once the arena of his ambition, became abstract and distant, while the interior of his mind dictated every waking moment. Physically, Hughes continued to deteriorate. Long-term injuries and substance dependence weakened his body, while inactivity and poor nutrition accelerated decline. Yet he refused meaningful medical intervention, perceiving doctors as intruders rather than helpers. Pain, fear, and mistrust blended into a single experience that reinforced his isolation. Without challenge or intervention, his beliefs went uncorrected, growing more rigid with time. The tragedy of Hughes's final years lies not in solitude alone, but in the absence of choice. Isolation was no longer a refuge he selected. It was a condition he could not escape. His vast wealth, once a source of freedom, now ensured that no one could override his decisions or compel treatment. Surrounded by silence and rituals, Hughes lived in a self-constructed prison where control replaced connection and safety came at the cost of life itself. By the end, the man who had conquered skies and industries existed within a space barely larger than a single room. The mid-1970s marked the culmination of a long psychological retreat, revealing how untreated mental illness can transform coping into captivity and autonomy into isolation so complete that even freedom becomes unreachable. Howard Hughes died on April 5, 1976, at the age of 70, marking the quiet end of one of the most extraordinary and tragic lives of the 20th century. He passed away not in a home of his own, nor in the public eye he had long abandoned, but while being transported by plane from Acapulco to Houston for medical treatment. For a man who had once conquered the skies and defined modern aviation, the irony was profound. His final journey occurred in near anonymity, accompanied by aides rather than friends, and shrouded in the secrecy that had come to define his last decades. By the time of his death, Hughes's physical condition reflected years of extreme neglect. Long-term malnutrition had left him severely underweight and weakened. His diet, restricted by obsessive fears and rigid rituals, had deprived his body of essential nutrients, accelerating organ failure and immune collapse. Chronic illnesses went unmanaged, compounded by decades-old injuries that had never fully healed. Prolonged dependence on prescription medications further strained his system, leaving his body fragile and exhausted. Reports from those who encountered Hughes at the end described a man barely recognizable as the former industrial titan. His hair and beard were long and unkempt, his nails severely overgrown and curled. Muscle wasting was evident, and his skin bore signs of prolonged immobility and poor circulation. He had withdrawn so completely from normal life that even basic bodily care had vanished, replaced by fear-driven avoidance rather than intention. The deterioration was so severe that when Hughes died, authorities reportedly could not immediately identify him through visual recognition alone. Instead, fingerprints were used to confirm his identity, a stark and sobering detail that underscored how thoroughly he had disappeared from public and physical recognition alike. The man once known worldwide for speed records, cinematic spectacles, and corporate power had become unrecognizable even in death. Hughes' passing marked the culmination of a long, unchecked decline. What began as brilliance fueled by ambition and wealth gradually eroded under the weight of untreated mental illness, physical trauma, and isolation. His obsessive-compulsive disorder, paranoia, and addiction were never meaningfully addressed, in part because his immense resources shielded him from intervention. Wealth granted him autonomy, but it also insulated him from the corrective forces that might have offered help or imposed care. In death, Hughes became both legend and cautionary tale. His achievements in aviation, film, and industry remain extraordinary, reshaping multiple fields and inspiring generations of innovators. Yet his final years reveal a parallel legacy, one of human vulnerability, untreated suffering, and the devastating consequences of isolation. Howard Hughes died as he had lived for decades, apart from the world. His death closed a story not only of towering achievement, but of profound loss, of health, of connection, and ultimately, of self. What do you think about Howard Hughes? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.